So just a couple more points on Gustafson, and what I really want to focus on are his A and B on pages 467, 468, 469. The A and B are just 2 points that he makes that are quite important for understanding his argument. Point A really is him trying to explain how grief differs from sorrow. Now remember, he believes that sorrow is the more general emotion, and that grief is a more specific thing, that we sorrow over lots of things, anything really, but that grief is really about persons. But they don't just differ in that way. They differ in the conative aspect. And by conative here, I think he just means wanting, and that his main point here is that sorrow, the conative aspect, is wish, whereas with grief, the conative aspect is desire. He says in the middle of page 467, point A, the emotions of grief and sorrow are alike in that they are intentional conditions. In fact, they admit the same objects. Intentional in the sense that they're about something. This is the philosopher's use of intentional, not intentional in the sense of willful, intentional in the sense of about something, focused on something, having to do with something. For instance, it can be true both that S grieves N's death and that T's emotion in connection with it is deep sorrow. That is, you can sorrow and grieve over someone's death, that they're different things. The fact on which the emotions are directed is N's death. Hence, in this case, these emotions are not distinguishable by differences in objects. That is, someone may grieve over a person's death. Another person may simply feel sorrow. What's the difference? Second to last paragraph on page 467. Therefore, on the assumption that grief and sorrow are genuinely different emotions, and in light of the fact that nominal differences, common objects, and possible common causes and consequences are all non-differentiating, it seems that the differences between these emotions can only be traced to differences in the ingredient conative, wanting elements. We have then the tentative result that if grief and sorrow are different emotions, their differentia consist in conative differences, since they need not be different with respect to other possible sources of differentiation. If so, then, unlike grief, sorrow over or about something does not involve a conation of the type which rationally ought to be belief consistent. That is, unlike grief, as pictured in theory G, sorrow's conative component is not desire or desiring in the full sense required for genuine grief. Rather, it is the counterpart of desiring, which is sorrow's conative element. The counterpart of desiring, which lacks the typical belief-consistent rationality requirement, is, of course, wishing. Okay. So, what is he saying here? Well, okay, X dies, a person dies, and if I am feeling sorrow, I am feeling unhappiness connected with the wishing that they hadn't died. But what does it mean to wish that they hadn't died? Well, you can believe that someone is dead. You can feel unhappy that they're dead, and you can wish that they're alive. But what Gustafson is saying is that is not irrational, because we can wish for anything, whether it's possible or impossible. Consequently, if, say, T is sorry about or over what S grieves is the death of N, then while S has the contrary belief desire that N did not die, T has the wish that N not have died. A wish that an event not have occurred is not under the constraint of rationality, that one wish only for what one supposes is possible. It is not therefore under the belief consistency requirement. In short, a person can wish for anything, possible or impossible, past as well as future events. This is because the logically appropriate objects of wishing is a wider category of situations or events than the appropriate objects of desire. That is, an irrational desire is a desire for something that one knows is impossible. But what would an irrational wish look like? I can wish that I could fly. I know I can't fly, but I wish that I could. There's nothing irrational about that. I think what he's saying is that a desire to fly, fly like Superman, is an inherently irrational thing, because I know I can't fly. But if I desire, that is, if I wish that it be so, that I could fly, my desire is in contradiction to, that is, what I want to happen, what I want to be so, that it be so, is in direct contradiction to my belief. Whereas if I simply wish, I'm not under the rationality constraint. So the big difference between simply being sorrowful over something and grieving over something really turns out to be that in the case of grief, we have a belief counter desire. In the case of sorrow, we have a belief counter wish. But because of the definite distinction between a desire, which is something that prompts me to action to fulfill that desire, and a wish, which really doesn't, grief is something different, and grief is therefore inherently irrational. Now, in section B, starting on page 468, what he goes on to say is that this account of grief actually explains a lot about grief. The fact that it is inherently irrational and that the desires that accompany grief are inherently unsatisfiable really do ring, that this does give us a satisfactory account of grief, because it accounts for some of the aspects of grief. It says on page 469, and often the actions in question have the further role of reducing the intensity of the feelings ingredient in the emotions with which they are associated. Flight relieves fear, action quells anger, hate is alleviated by action, and so on. So the peculiar strength and depth of the feeling of grief might well be explained by the absence of any rational motive force and the absence of associated action. That is, there's nothing we can do about grief. Maybe that's why it hurts so much. Other desires that we have can be satisfied, but the desire that someone be alive who's dead is inherently unsatisfiable, and may be one of the things that accounts for the particular experience of what it's like to grieve, because what grieve is really wanting, truly wanting something that's impossible. One grieves, he continues, in part just in that there is nothing which can be done. This is but another way of noting that there is nothing that one can do in relation to one's desires, because the desires are contrary to what one knows or believes to be the case. They are, quote, impossible desires. Also, in terms of justification of grief, he says at the bottom of 469, grief appears to leave no room for justification given its cause and genesis. While its severity, its manifestation in acts, its duration, and the like can require rational explanation and are open to considerations, grief itself is not something whose rationality is or is not explained by considerations the agent can give him or herself. That is, grief is unjustifiable. Not that it needs justification in a way, but grief is not something that you can, because it's inherently irrational, it's not something that you can say is justified or unjustified, because it just doesn't apply, because inherently grief is, to be grieving is to be in an irrational, conflicted state.